How you doing, Zay's? It's my found E. I'm sending you this video to let you know I wish you well. And you can do anything you put your mind to. With hard work and dedication, it's nothing you can't do. I hope this video made you smile. For sure.
And we start here at 6 with this, a search for answers. After this prominent local musical artist is killed, gunned down overnight on the east side of Indianapolis.
In April, someone shot Eric Butler and he lived. 57 days later, on the same stretch of street, someone shot him again. This time it worked. Investigators still don't know who pulled the trigger either time. Today we're asking the question nobody in Indianapolis has been able to answer. Was the first shooting a warning? And did somebody just wait for a second chance? Before we get into it, if you're new here, take a second to hit subscribe and turn on notifications because we cover cases like this every week and you don't want to miss the next one. If you've watched our channel before, you already know how much work goes into these breakdowns. So drop a like, leave a comment with your thoughts as we go, and share this with someone who follows true crime. It genuinely helps this channel keep going. Now, let's get into what happened to Eric Butler. Eric D. Butler was 35 years old when he died. To most of Indianapolis, he wasn't Eric. He was Lil E, a name that carried real weight in the city's hip-hop scene for more than a decade. He wasn't a national name, but locally he mattered. His song Punisher became something close to an anthem in Indianapolis, the kind of track people in the city knew by heart. He built a catalog that included Factual, Pressure, By the Block, and Hardly Breathe, along with projects like Eric Butler Versus. The state of Indiana, for a lot of fans, his music wasn't just entertainment. It was a reflection of the streets he came from and the life he'd actually lived. And that life was complicated. To understand what happened to Eric Butler, you have to understand who he was before the music, because his story didn't start with a microphone. It started on the streets of Indianapolis, tied to a name a lot of people in that city already knew. Richard Grundy. Grundy ran what authorities described as a violent drug trafficking operation in Indianapolis. Butler was connected to that world. Back in 2015, he was one of 11 people charged in connection with violent crimes tied to the Grundy operation. That case eventually fell apart in 2017, but it wasn't the end of his legal troubles. In 2018, Butler pleaded guilty to drug charges, and in 2023, his name made headlines again, this time in a much more visible way. Indiana State Police raided a house connected to the Grundy network. When officers moved in, Butler tried to get away by climbing out of an attic window. Cameras were rolling. The footage aired on local news. He was arrested and charged with cocaine dealing and unlawful possession of a firearm. It looked, at the time, like the kind of charge that could put him away for years. But in February 2025, a jury found him not guilty on every count. He walked free. And for a while, it seemed like Eric Butler might actually get the fresh start people close to him hoped for. He kept making music. He kept building his name in the city. But the streets he came from don't always let people leave that easily. And in the spring of 2026, that history caught up with him in the worst possible way. On April 23rd, 2026, Butler was shot in the 8000 block of East Washington Street, near South Franklin Road and Interstate 465. He survived. His condition was described as stable, and he was released from the hospital. No arrest was made. No motive was confirmed. At the time, it might have looked like one more violent incident in a life that had already seen plenty of them. A warning, maybe. A close call. Something Butler could walk away from and keep living his life. But here's where the story turns and where it starts raising real questions. Less than 2 months later, in the same part of the city, it happened again. This time, he didn't survive. Early on the morning of June 19th, 2026, just after 2 in the morning, Indianapolis Metropolitan Police officers responded to a report of a person shot in the 200 block of South Franklin Road. That location is less than a mile from where Butler had been shot in April. When officers arrived, they found him wounded. He was rushed to the hospital, but he died from his injuries. A car at the scene was found riddled with bullet holes. According to reporting on the IMPD investigation, a rifle was identified as the weapon used. Think about that for a second. because it matters more than it might first appear. 2 shootings, same general area, less than 60 days apart. The first time he survived. The second time he didn't. Does that pattern seem random to you? Or does it feel like something or someone was deliberately circling back? This is where speculation has to be separated carefully from fact. Investigators have not publicly confirmed that the April shooting and the June shooting are connected. No official statement has tied the 2 incidents together as the work of the same person or group. That connection exists in the minds of observers, in the pattern itself, but it has not been established as fact by police or by the ATF. It's a legitimate question to ask. It is not a confirmed answer. What we do know is that Butler's history made the investigation more complicated from the start. He'd been in and out of Marion County Jail 15 times over the years. He was, by his own documented past, someone connected to serious criminal activity, even after his 2025 acquittal. A local pastor and community advocate, Reverend Charles Harrison, spoke publicly after Butler's death, making the point that repeat involvement in that lifestyle often ends one of 2 ways, back in prison or as a victim of violence. It's a hard, blunt observation, but it reflects a reality that Indianapolis has seen play out again and again. That complexity matters because it shapes how investigators have to approach this case. When someone has a documented history connected to a violent criminal network, the pool of potential motives and potential suspects doesn't shrink. It grows. Was this retaliation tied to his past with the Grundy organization? Was it a personal dispute unrelated to any of that? Was the April shooting a warning that went unheeded, and the June shooting the follow-through? Right now, none of those questions have public answers. They're theories, discussed by fans, by local media, and by people who knew Butler, not conclusions reached by investigators. Let's sit with the Grundy connection for a moment, because it's the piece of Butler's story that keeps coming up whenever people try to make sense of his death. Richard Grundy was eventually sentenced to life in prison, and the organization tied to his name was described by authorities as one of the more violent drug operations Indianapolis had dealt with in years. Butler's association with that world went back close to a decade by the time he died. That doesn't mean his murder was connected to it. People move on from dangerous associations all the time, and a not guilty verdict in 2025 suggests, at minimum, that prosecutors couldn't prove he was still actively involved in criminal activity at that point. But in true crime cases like this, investigators can't just look at who a person was in their final months. They have to look at every relationship, every conflict, every debt or grudge that might have followed someone for years. That's part of why cases like this take time, and part of why silence from investigators doesn't necessarily mean a lack of progress. It can mean the opposite. It can mean they're being careful not to name anyone before they're certain. There's also the question of what the April shooting actually was. We know Butler was shot on East Washington Street near South Franklin Road, and we know he survived with what was described as a stable condition. What we don't know, because it hasn't been made public, is who was there, how many shots were fired, or whether Butler himself gave police any information about what happened. In cases involving someone with Butler's history, victims are sometimes reluctant to cooperate fully with police, whether out of distrust or a preference to handle things outside the legal system. We don't know if that happened here. It's a gap in the public record, not a confirmed fact, but it's worth asking. Did the answers to the June shooting already exist somewhere in April, in a hospital room, in a conversation that never made it into a police report? What we do know is what happened after his death. His identity was confirmed by the Marion County Coroner's Office. Homicide detectives, including Detective Christina Friel with IMPD, took on the case and asked the public for any information about the shooting. Weeks passed without a break in the case. And then on July 2nd, 2026, the ATF stepped in publicly, announcing they were assisting IMPD with the investigation and offering a $5,000 reward for information leading to an arrest. In their statement, the agency called it a senseless act of violence and said they were providing all available resources to bring whoever was responsible to justice. Think about what that tells us. Federal involvement in a local homicide case isn't automatic. When the ATF steps in and puts money behind a reward, it usually signals that a case has stalled, that local investigators need more public tips to move forward, or that there's a broader concern about the circumstances. As of that July announcement, no suspect information had been released. The investigation remained open. It's also worth noting what the ATF's involvement typically means from a resource standpoint. The agency doesn't just offer reward money. It often brings forensic support, ballistics analysis, and access to firearm tracing databases that local departments don't always have on hand. If a rifle really was the weapon used, tracing that firearm back to a purchase, a previous crime scene, or an owner could become one of the more promising paths forward in this case. That's speculation about method, not a claim about what investigators have actually found, but it's a reasonable place to imagine the investigation heading next. Butler's death didn't happen in isolation, either. Just weeks before he was killed, on May 5th, another figure in the local music scene, a producer and rapper who went by Playboy the Great, was murdered at his East Side apartment. He'd worked with major names in the industry and was gaining real traction. Two homicides, two respected figures in Indianapolis's hip-hop community, within about 6 weeks of each other. That timing hit the local music scene hard, and it left a lot of people in that community asking whether something larger was happening, whether this was a coincidence of a violent year or a sign of a deeper pattern. That question, too, remains unanswered. What made Butler's death resonate beyond the crime itself was what he represented to people who knew him. An audio engineer who worked closely with him in the studio described him simply as a legend in the city, someone whose loss didn't feel real even as it was being confirmed. Friends and collaborators pushed back gently against the way his public image had often been reduced to his legal troubles, pointing instead to his growth as an artist and as a person in the years before his death. That tension between the man with the criminal record and the man his friends were mourning is part of what makes this case genuinely so hard to sum up in a single sentence. Let's go back to that 57-day window, because it's worth sitting with a little longer. In April, Butler survived. He got medical treatment, recovered, and by all appearances went back to his life. He kept working. He kept showing up in the city he'd always called home. If someone truly wanted him dead in April, why wait almost 2 months to try again? Was there a reason for the delay? A plan that needed time to come together? Or is the timing simply a coincidence that feels more significant on camera than it actually was in real life? These are the kinds of questions that keep true crime communities coming back to a case, and they're questions that, right now, only the person responsible can actually answer. So where does that leave us right now? Here's what we can say with confidence. Eric Butler, known as Lil E, survived a shooting in April 2026. He was killed in a second shooting in June, in the same part of Indianapolis, using a rifle with no suspect identified. The ATF is actively involved and has offered a financial reward for information. Detectives have asked the public directly for help. And as of the most recent public update, the case remains unsolved. Here's what we can't say with confidence. We don't know if the two shootings are connected. We don't know the motive. We don't know if this was retaliation tied to his past, a personal conflict, or something investigators haven't shared with the public yet. Could investigators be sitting on information they haven't released, waiting for the right moment or the right tip to make an arrest? That happens more often than people realize. Or is this simply a case that's gone cold, one of far too many unsolved shootings in cities across the country? What do you think really happened on South Franklin Road? Do you think the April shooting and the June shooting are connected? Or is that just a pattern that feels meaningful but isn't? And does the involvement of the ATF, months after his death, tell you anything about where this investigation stands? Does the 57-day gap between the two shootings seem like the kind of detail investigators might already be focused on, even if they haven't said so publicly? Eric Butler's story is still missing an ending. Somewhere in Indianapolis, someone knows what happened in the early hours of June 19th. Until that person comes forward, or until investigators find another way to close this case, Lil E remains another name on a growing list of unsolved homicides, a talented voice from a city that hasn't stopped asking questions. For his family, for the many fans who grew up listening to his music, and for a music scene still grieving more than one loss this year, an answer would mean far more than closure. If you found this analysis informative, Don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Real True Crime Analysis, and turn on notifications so you never miss another investigation. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next case.